The issue of land ownership in South Africa has been at the center of the liberation struggle from the inception of colonialism to the end of apartheid. Next year, the country will be celebrating 30 years into our democracy and will be voting for the 7th time. However, the recent land audit reveals that white South Africans still account for more than 70% of the country's commercial agricultural land, while black people own 4%. With tonight's episode, I'm Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, and welcome to Unfiltered. Has land reform failed in South Africa? Joining us to unpack this discussion is author of the book The Land is Ours, Advocate Thembeka Ncukaitobi SC, and from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, we're joined by Professor Ruth Hall. Thank you very much for joining us, and Advocate Ncukaitobi, thank you for joining us, Professor Hall. I guess let's start with, to what extent has land redistribution, which is where I'd like to focus a lot of our discussion tonight, failed? There's been this promise of 30% of land redistribution by 2014. We sit 10 years after that. Can you take us through the extent of success or failure on land redistribution?
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and good evening to Ruth, who is my friend and colleague. Very pleased to have you, Ruth. Yes, the short answer is that land redistribution has been a catastrophic failure. From a purely statistical perspective, if you look at how much land that was previously owned by white people as a result of colonialism and apartheid did in fact transfer hands into black hands. So if you look at those numbers, it's plain that there has been a failure. So, and it's not difficult to do the calculations. When Nelson Mandela became president in 1994, the campaign promise contained in the Reconstruction and Development Program was that there would be a 30% transfer of land in the first 5 years of democracy, not 2014, in the first 5 years of democracy. That would have taken us to 1999. And those numbers were based on what they thought the market activity at the time looked like. At the time, there were 6% farms that were sold every year. So they just did a rough calculation, 6 times 5, and then they thought, all right, perhaps we can do with 30% in the first 5 years. After the first 5 years, the numbers were abysmal. We were talking not more than 1%. Last year, which is the, my numbers go up to last year, not me, it's President Ramaphosa who gave a speech at the ANC conference. He said that only 11% had been transferred, 11%, those were his numbers. And so that means that compared to the goal of 1999, as of 2022, we were sitting at 11%. Now that's the president of the country speaking. So it's quite clear that this has been an abysmal failure. Absolutely.
Professor Hall, can I come to you, and could I ask you to also help us distinguish between restitution, tenure reform, and land redistribution, and then respond to Advocate Ncukaitobi's assessment of where we are on that third leg of land redistribution?
Certainly. Thanks, Sizwe, and nice to be with you both. I totally concur with what Thembeka has set out. Remember that the idea that there should be a redistribution of land was really the thrust of what the land question was at the time of political transition. But because the whole debate about property rights was getting caught up in the CODESA negotiations, there were groups of people who said, well, listen, we don't want to generally have access to land. There's particular land that we've been dispossessed of, often within living memory. We just want to return to our own land. So the demand for restitution for people who had particular claims to particular land emerged. And that actually moved a bit faster because there was a group of people who demanded we want to go back, and they were working with lawyers, and they got that right to restitution into the Constitution. But of course, it's such a limited right. And most people around South Africa were not part of families that owned land by 1913. So So that 1913 cut-off date for land claims was limiting for many people. But so, as you say, this idea about transforming land relations is surely about, firstly, redistributing who has access to land, but also changing the nature of property rights. And I think that often the debate around land in South Africa suggests if you can just transfer private ownership from one to another, then we're changing things. You know, some of the more profound and more radical ideas about land reform is that it's actually about dismantling a hierarchy between those who own property, private property, and those who don't. And if we think about it, actually the majority of people in South Africa have access to land under very insecure terms. So tenure reform is actually quite a potentially far-reaching notion that people who have informal property rights, people who live in informal settlements, people who work on and live on farms, people who live in communal areas, these are rights. And they should be recognized as such. And the fact that only certain forms of property have been recognized in law and by government, that is surely the most colonial legacy there is notions of Western exclusive private property trumping everything else. So we do have these three elements: the redistribution of land, which I agree has been a dismal failure. It's also just been poorly conceived. What is it for? Who wants access to land? Not everybody wants to be a commercial farmer. There's demand for land for all kinds of things. The restitution process has been too slow. And the reality is that still we have a system where private ownership trumps all other kinds of rights. And so again and again, we see people desperately trying to hold on to pieces of land and being moved off, whether it's people being evicted from informal settlements, being moved off customary land to make way for mining deals. So actually we see ongoing routine violation of rights. So I think the problem goes far beyond a failure of redistribution. Black South Africans are continuing to lose access to land, and we see growing concentration and corporate ownership, transnational and by white South Africans, of valuable land. So we're actually seeing an entrenchment in many ways of this inequality, which is not unlike what's happening in the rest of our economy.
I want to go deeper into the question you raise about the way we conceive of land reform and whether redistribution is in fact even the right way to look at the question. But before we do that, and of course feel free to respond to anything that Professor Hall has said, Advocate Mukai-Tobi, but can you also help us to understand, okay, so we've got restitution, which is people who specifically lost land after 1913 going back to that land. Tenure reform is the rights on the land. And then redistribution is just about the fairness of land ownership, not necessarily bringing people back to land that they've lost, but just the sheer inequality of land ownership in terms of race. There are all these statistics on the one hand and other statistics on the other. The state claims that a certain amount of land has been transferred, agricultural industry another amount. Can you help us make sense of, in terms of the commercial agricultural land in South Africa, what statistics we should trust and exactly how much has been actually transferred?
Well, I mean, they have done two of these studies. They did a study in 2013 and they reconfirmed the study in 2017. Both studies ultimately show that in commercial agriculture, that's commercial agriculture I'm talking about,
sure,
there is still a 72% white ownership. And by white ownership, you include individuals, corporations, and institutions, and 4% black ownership. And again, you do the same for black ownership. And the numbers of women ownership, which is another factor we omit, are equally dismal and depressing, because as of the 2017 statistics, that was 1% African women who were actually in ownership of land. So those are the raw numbers. Obviously, agricultural industry and big commercial agriculture disputes the numbers.
Yeah.
But when you interrogate their numbers, they ultimately come to 18% of black ownership of land. But even if you accepted 18% black ownership of the land, If you compare that to the goal of 1994, which was 30% in the first 5 years.
Yeah. Let alone 2024.
Let alone, yes, 2024, let alone 2014, because they have revised all of these goals. The most comprehensive study on this was conducted by former President Kgalema Motlanthe. And I think they did research over a period of 3 years. It was a devastating report that they ultimately produced, because what it showed was that if we continue according to the current trajectory, and we include, because you remember President Zuma also opened up the process, we include old order claims, new order claims, and then we try and solve all of those. They said that it would take us 700 years to ultimately complete the entire process of land reform. Notwithstanding that report, there has simply been no action on the part of the state to recognize the crisis that we face as far as land redistribution is concerned.
Absolutely. We are in discussion with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi SC, as well as Professor Ruth Hall. We are going to be going to a speech that's being given by President Cyril Ramaphosa, but we will continue with our discussion and cut to that speech before that. Professor Hall, Advocate Ngcukaitobi paints a very grim and terrifying picture of the snail's pace. In fact, the pace at which land reform has moved makes snails look rapid. What do you think is behind the sheer inertia of our efforts to get serious about land reform?
Okay, so Sizwe, you made an interesting statement earlier, which is that the land question has been sort of foundational to liberation movements in South Africa. I think that it's actually worth thinking about the extent to which that is really true. I think that our ruling party, while definitely bringing out land question as sort of part of political gesturing, actually has shown in real terms, both in terms of using the constitution and the law, using budgets, pushing land reform, that this really has not actually been a priority. Since 1994, this has not been a priority. For many years, less than 1% of the national budget was spent on land reform. To all intents and purposes, over the past 10 years, the entire land reform program has been largely dismantled. It's just been underfunded, less staffing. So, we've done the graphs and you can just see a peak around 2007, 2008, and then from then on, it's just declined and declined. So, one of the disturbing things that we find is that the available information about the rate at which black people are being evicted from land, for instance, people who live and work on farms. For many years, the rate at which people were being evicted from rural land was faster than the rate at which black people were gaining access to land through land reform. So, in terms of racial disparity, it's not even clear that we're going slowly or we're going backwards. The important thing here, I think, firstly, is to say that there's a class issue. And that the state has been quite clear over time, especially since 2000, around that time, that the purpose of a land reform program is about establishing a small class of black commercial farmers, not about fundamentally restructuring who has access to land. It's not about addressing the widespread problem of people just not having a place to be, a place to stay. And so I think that there's a total, and I find it sort of almost, it's sort of offensively painful, I think, for many people, that there's something as real and potent as the images that you're showing, which is the experience of land dispossession, which was also sort of a stripping of citizenship, stripping of all kinds of, that this is being sort of weaponized, often in quite cynical ways, where the land question is brought out to signify, we're going to do something. But I think that a crucial thing here is to note that land reform has been not just going slowly. The state has chosen not to use its power. So I think that we need to be real about the state's interests and ask questions as to what the government wants to achieve with land reform. Our own research shows that it's primarily for a small class of black commercial farmers And yet the rhetoric around it is very much based on the fact that around urban centres, people are desperate for a place to live. In rural areas, people are desperate for a secure place to live and some land to farm. So I think that there's a real politics of land on the ground. There are people who are struggling in informal settlements, in the city buildings where they're occupying. There are people who have been evicted from farms. There are people who are struggling against mining companies in parts of Northwest and Eastern Cape. That's the real politics of land. It's quite different from the kind of political posturing around the Constitution, because the reality is that the state has chosen not to expropriate land, even within the Constitution. So I think that now is a good time, some years after the debate about expropriation without compensation, to actually refocus on the real politics, which is linked to social movements who want to have freedom from evictions, who want access to services, who want an accountable state, who want a state that responds to real demands. And so I think that the idea of the abstract land issue is sort of, it's a bit of a dead duck, this idea that we just need to do more of the same.
Let me put that to Advocate Ngugai Tobi, and Professor Hall raises firstly the question of just the lack of political will around questions of land reform, and whether some of the moves that we have seen in the recent past around the expropriation bill and the Constitution actually don't get to the heart of people's true experiences on the ground with land rights.
Yeah, I think I want to add, I agree with what Ruth says insofar as the willingness of the government, let's put it like that, the willingness of the government to implement the Constitution. Because we always forget that land reform is actually a mandate of the Constitution to the government. The ANC government was elected in 1994 in part to give black people the land that they lost under apartheid. And it was a central part of their mandate. So they elected to ignore this mandate over a period of 30 years. Now, you can ask why they do that. Ruth posits the idea that they have not prioritized land reform. That's absolutely on point. There are many other things they have prioritized, but land has not been one of them. In the last 5 years, in fact, in 2018, to be specific, there was clearly a political pressure from below. Firstly, the pressure began in 2017 at the ANC conference, and then the pressure was reinforced in February 2018 in Parliament, spearheaded by the EFF. That is what created the posturing around land reform, the pretense that we will do something radical about land reform. But 5 years later, it has been proven to be nothing but a pretense. So, which means that we have to go back to the beginning. The real activists interested in land reform need to start asking the real questions. Who needs land for what? The approach of the government, as Ruth points out, has been that land reform is about getting a few farms to as few black people as possible. And one of the problems with that approach is who gets to choose who these people are. And the numbers that have been given actually by PLUS itself, which is Ruth's center, has been that there is a considerable number of elites, people that have access to the government. And they are the ones that are enjoying the benefits of land reform. So which means that there is a need for a rethink so that land serves the many and not the few.
Let's go to a break. We're in discussion with two of South Africa's foremost minds on the question of land reform and land justice in South Africa, Advocate Thembeka Ngugai Tobi SC and Professor Ruth Hall. When we come back from the break, we'll also discuss questions of the law and how it's been invoked to forward the question of land reform, and we'll dive deeper into the suggestion that we need to rethink and reframe land reform as a whole. Stick with us.
It is our contention that this is a brazen attempt by the governing party to amend the Constitution through the back door using ordinary legislation. It cannot be countenanced that a clause that was deemed so pivotal as to require a constitutional amendment should now just be adopted in the House by a simple majority.
This bill would basically leave the almost 72% of the land owned by whites in the country untouched, and the government would still need to pay market value for expropriating white-owned land for land reform purposes.
Land reform is not really the main issue for this bill from the governing party. It is about power. It is to get hold of land in South Africa.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm in conversation with Professor Ruth Hall and Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi on the question of land reform in South Africa. Advocate Ngcukaitobi, could I ask you, before we went to the break, we were having an interesting conversation about the parliamentary debate and the formal political debate about land, and whether that's out of touch in some ways with the true question of land. But of course, you're also an expert on land law. And one of the main attempts to deal with land reform in the recent past is the Expropriation Bill. This is a bill that's supposed to empower the government to expropriate land. What are your thoughts on this bill and the Expropriation Bill? And you made quite a fascinating statement in a public talk recently at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, at which you said that this hardly deals with the real question of expropriation as South Africans think of it in everyday language.
Yes, it's interesting because I actually wrote about this in my book in 2021 already. Expropriation in the South African context is a method to assist the government to acquire land and property for its own use. And that was the point behind the 1975 Expropriation Act. And for those who don't know, in 1975, what the National Party government wanted to do was to acquire land in order to create homelands. And it needed a law in order to do that. So it would acquire the land, and then it would pay compensation to those people that did acquire the land. But the point was to create the Transkei, because the Transkei was a political project. And historically, that is what expropriation has always been about. It's been a mechanism to assist the government to acquire the land for its own purposes. So it may want to build a school, it may want to build a dam, it may want to build a health facility, it may want to build a road, and as we know, under the National Party government, it may want to do something as perverse as creating a country. But that is not the crisis that faces South Africa. The crisis facing South Africa is land is needed not for the use by the state, but for the broader public interest. Land is needed by you, by me, by many people. So the Expropriation Act in Section 2 and 3, the current bill rather, in Sections 2 and 3, follow the traditional approach to an expropriation, which is you acquire from private into public, but you never transfer it to the private again. And that is why it's quite misguided for the ANC to create the impression that through the expropriation bill, it will resolve the land problem. Because what the land problem is about, it is about many private citizens who need land for consumption, for occupation, for exploitation, for use. They are not going to acquire that through the expropriation bill. What we need in South Africa is a land redistribution bill. It's the bill that will enable the state to acquire the land from private hands in order to distribute to other private hands. The only difference would be both class and race. And unfortunately, the ANC has been silent on when it will introduce a land redistribution bill.
The fact that we haven't got a land redistribution bill nearly 30 years into democracy, and that the expropriation bill itself isn't that bill, is just so disappointing in so many ways, Professor Hall. What are your thoughts on Parliament's attempts to address this problem, let alone not doing anything for 29 years, but even this new attempt doesn't seem to actually address the problem head on as you framed it?
Surely the challenge of land reform is about pushing for redistribution. The expropriation bill is all about the state's relationship with landowners. But what we've seen is that the main problem is that where the state acquires land, it's either unable or unwilling to redistribute it in a transparent, fair way to people who need it for basic livelihood purposes. So if you think about the relations between state, private landowners, and citizens who want access to land, it only deals with the relationship between state and private landowners. So what's been missing in the whole expropriation without compensation debate is on what basis and how will the decisions be made, who should get access to land. So in a sense, we're having a proxy debate about something that's not entirely real. You know, what was called for by the Motlanthe panel in 2017 was a law that would give effect to, I think, really one of the most important elements of the property clause that says the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures to enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. Now, how can citizens say, I want that right, in the same way that people can demand a right to healthcare, a right to antiretrovirals? How do you say to the state, we are landless, we have nowhere to be in our own country? How can we be criminalized for being where we are? So I think that the idea that there must be a law where people can say to the state, it's over to you now. We have these needs. We have these demands. What are you going to do about our urgent needs? And surely, constitutionally, those with the most urgent needs must get them addressed first, not the people who want to build big businesses. So I think that there is a serious social justice case for creating a right to land for basic livelihood purposes. One thing that the Brazilians did is they created a clause in the constitution that said people who are landless, who openly occupy land for a period of time, must be recognized as the de facto owners. So I think that, you know, what we're seeing is that actually people are doing land reform in South Africa. They're doing it through land occupation. In and around cities, in rural areas, in inner city buildings, people are trying to redistribute land for their basic livelihood. And the problem is that you have a state that's criminalizing that while also having a very limited elitist program. So I think that the debate now should be about linking the rural and urban demand for land. It cannot be the case that the demand for land is only for commercial farming. You know, many people want land for urban agriculture, for a place to live. And the idea that we must keep whole farms intact and then people must fit in with the land. No. People are wanting smaller plots and are wanting to experiment with access to land. We have a crisis of unemployment in cities. People cannot get jobs. And the idea of using land in multiple ways, including for food production, must be available. So the idea of using land in a way that is socially responsible and responsive to the crisis of livelihoods that we face surely means shifting the focus away from just agricultural production to just survival and reproduction, and we're going to have to do that. And the reality is that there are these flashpoints around the country where people are trying to survive, and the state is not listening. And so I think that this idea that there must be a right to land and that the state has to be forced to be responsive, I think, you know, there are cases where people are now starting to prepare to take the state to court to demand this right to land.
Toby, before we heard from President Ramaphosa there, we were talking about Professor Hall's interesting intervention about a right to land and how that could reframe land relations. Do you think that can be found within the current constitution, or do we build out a constitutional right to land in the first place? And what's your response to how we can advance and deepen the right to land in South Africa?
Yeah. No, I think it can be found within Section 25, and I suppose it ties up with the point I tried to make earlier, which is that Section 25 is a fundamentally transformative provision. It is a mandate to the state to transform land relations. And that mandate you find in three central provisions of Section 25. Number one is the right to restitution. Very few constitutions in the world entitle people that were formerly colonized to return. You see, physically return to where you were dispossessed from. It's a limited right because of the cutoff date of 1930, sure. But it's nevertheless a potentially important right for those who can return. And number two, people are entitled to redistribution of land. In the Constitution, it's called equitable access to the land. And then number three, they are entitled to security of tenure, or to tenure which is secure, and that's the language of the Constitution. Those three components are a package of this right to the land. So you are entitled to return. If you cannot show that you are entitled to return because you cannot show that you were dispossessed or your forebears were dispossessed, that doesn't mean you have no entitlement to the land, because equitable access speaks to people that want the land, need the land, but cannot afford using their own means. It then imposes a duty on the state to pass legislation and to take other means reasonably and progressively to ensure that. So that's where the right to land is. I think what Ruth is talking about is that has not been translated from the Constitution into the nitty-gritty of legislation, and that is where there is a big constitutional gap.
Indeed. Professor Hall, your thoughts on Advocate Mukatobi's response to your initial point about a right to land, and how do we deepen that right going forward into the future?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that, this goes to the heart of the question of whether one thinks that fundamental change in the structure of our economy and in class relations and in racial inequality is going to come from above, from the state, that it's going to be delivered at some point, or whether it's going to be driven from below through ordinary people taking matters into their own hands, building people's movements. And my view is that for many years people have believed that going politely to many workshops around legal reforms and so on, and policy development will yield results. And my perspective, looking at how that's gone, is that we have a lot of things in place. Yes, we don't have clarity about how people can claim this right to land. It is in our Constitution, but the state has not laid out that process. But what I think is that one of the reasons why this demand for land, what we saw in 2018 when there was the expropriation without compensation debate, it just resonated across society, whether people were for it or against it. It goes to the heart of our identity and of our grappling or non-grappling with history. So I'm glad that Tembeka, mentioned colonization. You haven't talked about decolonizing the land, but surely changing the right to land means fundamentally undoing this idea that private ownership is everything, or that the state must be trustee of everything, and that there can be citizens' rights. So I think that this is actually a very fertile time. We're coming up to elections. The election cycle is already beginning with the land issue coming back. As I say, this issue is almost performative in that it will come back towards election time. But I think that this is a good moment for people who are involved with grassroots struggles, not just political rhetoric, but actual struggles. People who are facing evictions, people who are trying to occupy land, people who are desperately trying to invoke this claim and invoke this right that's there, and yet they're being, hammered and facing the wrath of the state or private security. This is a time for people to start democratic conversations about what this right to land means, and to give it real content. And I think that one of the difficulties of the expropriation without compensation debate is that it was marked by pretty much sort of political posturing by parties. And in my view, the ANC just held that space for a few years and allowed the issue to disappear. So the ANC held a sort of a talk EFF but walk DA kind of line on the land issue. And now it's just gone quiet. We sit with an expropriation bill. It will quite possibly go through. I expect it to. Tembeka might tell us something about the land court. Fixing the land court can help. All these things can help, but only if you have a state that is actually being compelled by citizens to do something, and to do something that disrupts existing inequalities. And we don't quite have that. We have the struggles that we see on the screen here, but they're sporadic. They're around the country. And I think that linking up some of these social movements that are saying we want more democratic governance. We don't want government selling off public land. We don't want elitist development that sideline poor people out of cities. These are the grassroots struggles. And that's the space where I think the impetus can come from, for people to say, here's what this right means in practice.
Advocate Mugaitobi, as we conclude this evening, how do you respond to what Professor Hall says? But can I also take you to a statement you made recently in that public lecture you gave on land about the potential unconstitutionality of South Africa's government, its parliament's failure to move on land over the last 30 years, and how that itself may contravene the Constitution?
Yes, there is an obligation in the Constitution that says that the state must take reasonable legislative measures to ensure equitable access to land. Now, this is what intellectuals, academics, and lawyers and judges have described as land redistribution. It's ensuring equitable access. Now, the problem is that you cannot achieve equitable access unless you have an overarching legislation. So the unconstitutionality has been the failure of Parliament to enact legislation to give effect to this provision in the Constitution. Even the right to restitution, by the way, is mandated by the Constitution. But you know, the Restitution Act was Nelson Mandela's very first statute that he signed into law. The ANC thereafter should have followed up with, whether you call it the Land Redistribution Bill or a different bill, but a bill that gives effect to the right of equitable access to the land. So we have, I'm afraid, been living in a state of unconstitutionality for the last 30 years.
Well, Advocate Mugaitobi, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Hall, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to hear your insights and to get you on the same platform at once, I think is a rare treat. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for joining us on Unfiltered. I hope you've gained deeper insight into the question of land reform, not just its past, but also the urgency of its future. Let's continue this conversation on social media. Tweet us at Unfiltered SABC on X, and join us for further conversations of unfiltered news, unfiltered views, and unfiltered conversations going forward. Have a good evening.